Okay, in keeping with our theme of research today, because remember day 2 is research day, so far we had a broad overview of developing a research agenda. We got some really good ideas. We're going to be following it up with an IATR survey. Then we probed into at least one of the broader topics, paratransits. And then we actually saw the potential for research in action, which was the whole point of Professor Fell's and the last panel that we just saw, where different cities conduct inquiries and go in a systematic way about possibly using prior studies and best practices to determine what they should do to make their systems better. Also, you know, the IATR has, I think for probably the first time ever, entered into a partnership for a joint research project, which has been going on for several years, which many of you may be, which has very practical impacts upon all of your jobs for several years now. And I'm pleased to report that Cami, Dr. Menendez, who's going to come up here in 2 seconds, is nearing completion of the report. And we anticipate that within a few short months, we'll have a final report which is going to release the findings of a very detailed study involving cameras and partitions and the ability to protect our drivers and what might be better, what might be worse, best practices, and what's going on out there. And I think this report, once it's released, will be very helpful to practitioners, to the industry, and to the academic community at large. Cami works for the National Institute of Occupational Safety and Health, which is a division of the Centers for Disease Control, Prevention. Dr. Menendez, or Cami Menendez, is somebody who's been a researcher for many years. She began with her doctorate in epidemiology and has been funded by NIOSH for this and many other studies that have nothing to do with taxis. So I think she'll probably talk a little bit about her welcoming into the taxi world, which I hope was a good experience for you. Has been around the country and North America and even beyond, talking to various people about taxis, but has been to all the major cities, I think, meeting with police departments who, unfortunately, sometimes it's harder to get statistics out of folks who have nothing to do with regulation, especially crime statistics. So she's been working very hard on this, and we're very pleased to have her on the team, and we're looking forward to, at our next conference, talking about, especially in D.C., which is not too far from where she is, talking about the findings of this great study. So she's going to give an update, put some slides on, and be happy to answer any questions. So without further ado, Dr. Cami Menendez.
Thanks so much for coming to this talk. I know it's very busy and it's late in the afternoon. And I'll be brief. I do actually have preliminary findings. Last year I came just with an update, but right now I have preliminary findings, and that's kind of an exciting thing. So what I've done right now is I've only had a chance just this week to analyze the data that I have for cameras. This talk does not address partitions. I don't touch on partitions because I don't want to say anything until I have any data to support what I'm saying. So this talk right now will focus on cameras. So taxicab driver fatalities have decreased over the past 20 years, but they remain one of the most dangerous occupations in the US and Canada. They remain higher than national rates, and by national, I mean the average American worker. And I'm personally, based on previous data that we've collected and studies we've published on, but we're expecting to see an increase in, and I hate to say it, but in taxicab homicide rates as city crime rates began rising. They began rising last year in many cities, and I'm worried what that's going to do to the taxicab driver population. So here's a figure of the point I'm trying to illustrate. So at the bottom is time, it's year. Your left axis, your left vertical axis, that's the homicide rate for taxicab drivers. It's the white dashed line. It's the number of killed taxicab drivers per 10,000 drivers. So it starts at about 5, it goes up, and then it decreases to about 1. Well, The right axis begins from 0 and it goes all the way up to 0.09. So that black line is all workers. So that's on an entirely different scale. Yes, they are both decreasing, but that white dashed line is so many times 10-fold, 20-fold, 30-fold over the rest of the working population that it's just incredibly dramatic. So for the work that I do, the taxi cab driver population is a very, very important population for us. So for our perspective, the prevention measures, I think in about 1999, the industry led, I know this is in Houston, they led the installation of taxi cab cameras in taxi cabs. And then this was followed in some other cities with ordinances. And, prevention measures. These are mostly your partitions, GPS and automated dispatch, your cashless systems, cameras, and then safety training. And then across all of these cities, you have this this tremendous variability in the adoption of prevention measures. In an ideal world, someone for what I study, it would be so nice if you had the same intervention in every single city, but of course that's not how the world works, and you have this great variability, so it presents interesting situations, and every city has their own needs and solutions, but I've tried to account for all this variability in this study. So cameras as a safety feature. Using cameras as a safety feature, similar to what they've done with convenience stores, another population that I work with, it's based on the principles of crime prevention by surveillance. If somebody knows they're under surveillance or they suspect they're under surveillance, chances are they're going to behave better. And then with affordability and availability of safety cameras recently, it's really facilitated the adoption of these cameras by leading taxi companies, and also ordinances. Cities have begun being able to pass ordinances requiring installation of security cameras in taxi cabs for those cities who feel that taxi cab cameras are the way to go. But there are key public health questions that arise whenever you kind of make the decision, should we install cameras in our taxi cabs? And the first of those is, are cameras truly effective in preventing crimes against taxi cab drivers? We know it makes sense, it's logical, that's always a wonderful thing, but it's always nice if we can also find the data to support these ideas. And then what features should cameras be equipped with for maximum effectiveness? So as Matt was saying, we partnered in a binational study. It's a multi-city study. It's a partnership with you guys. We have a nice letter of agreement that I have to update and put on file in my director's office every year. And so I traveled to prominent metropolitan areas in both Canada and the US. And the reason why I say traveled, I know probably when I talk to my family, they're thinking this is what my government is spending money on, is sending you to all these cities in Canada and the US. But it's very, very difficult to get data over the phone. So whenever I go and I make contacts in person and I arrive, usually people are more willing to work with me when I'm not as easier to get rid of when I appear in their city. So when I go, for each city, I ask for the camera status of that city. Do they have cameras installed or not? What proportion of the cars are they installed in? And when were they installed? The number of licensed taxi cabs per city. I appreciate so much that y'all have given me this data, because this is, some cities update their reports every year and they have this at their fingertips, but other cities, I know this data is so hard to come by, and I really appreciate for those of you who are able who get me the number of licensed taxi cabs per city per year since 1996 that I asked for, and I really appreciate that. Also, crime reports. I've been collecting crime reports or statistics involving taxi cab drivers. I go to the police department, I ask for crime reports. Sometimes I get statistics. Beggars can't be choosers. So I really appreciate this. This is used to validly measure an outcome. And also the city crime rates. I've got to control for these cities. Since some cities are safer than others, I really have to have the background crime statistics for each city. And for that, I get that data from for the US, I get it from the FBI, the UCR crime data. And then for Canada, there's something I discovered that's wonderful called Canada Statistics. They have everything. I call them, they're very nice, and I get my data in 2 days. And they went back as far back as 1980 for me. So I really love Canada Statistics. So the study design was a time series, because I look at multiple years. For the US, that was from 1996 to 2010. For Canada, it was 1980 to 2010. And I have pre-post data, which means I have data on crime rates pre-camera installation, and then data on crime rates post-camera installation. It's nice to have that comparison because you want a before and after effect. And then comparison groups. I have controls. I have some cities that serve as controls because they don't have cameras installed in their cabs. And so as not to contaminate the study, they don't have partitions installed in their cabs either. So the control cities, the comparison cities, they don't have cameras nor partitions. Now, newspaper clipping data. This is a wonderful resource for us. I know 3 years ago when we came, maybe y'all weren't so excited about it because the problem is, well, I'll go into that in a second. It complements the crime reports. It's more complete throughout the time period. Usually when there's a homicide, it hits the paper, at least of a taxi cab driver, because it's such a horrific thing. This data is very complete. When I go to police departments and I ask for crime reports, very, very helpful, very well-intentioned, but sometimes in dredging up the crime reports, a couple might be missed. One might be missed a year, and it's hard because police detectives or the stats units and police departments, they don't necessarily file crime reports away by occupation, which of course someone in my field would love. They have their own method of archiving things and storing things. So, but newspaper clippings data and crime report data have the same limitation, as it turns out. And what I mean is the driver that's killed, that's murdered, I have his name, but because data are archived for not so long a time, I think, by the regulators, which is fine, I'm not able to ascertain if the driver that was killed was licensed at the time or not, or what company he was working for. So that was a little bit of a limitation. It turned out not to be a limitation. We were worried it was going to be a major limitation, but it turned out not to be one, because what you would expect is it would kind of contaminate the study design, because it wouldn't be fair for those licensed drivers who had cameras and they were doing everything that they were supposed to, adhering to the law, and then here you have thrown into the study these drivers that simply weren't. But so I was expecting that to bias my results towards the null. That means seeing no effect. And that would be a rate ratio of 1, and I'll show the rate ratios in a second. But this turned out not to be the case at all. Or if there was, I was still able to see an effect. So the crime report data, there were 8 cities with cameras that I was able to get crime reports from police on, or I should say wrangle. And there were 2 control cities, Tampa and Denver. The dates in the parentheses, those are the years in which the majority of the cabs that were going to have cameras were already installed. So I accounted for that. And because I promised you guys I would aggregate the data, I wouldn't put up data spotlighting a city, at least not at this time when things are preliminary. I just aggregated the data for the purpose of this presentation. And so the distribution of homicides pre versus post camera installation for these cities that I was able to get crime reports on, there were 15 homicides pre-installation and only 2 homicides post-installation. And and this is just the camera cities, and that's pretty darn compelling. So, just to be on the safe side, and because I was trained to do this, I took all that data, even though we already have a pretty compelling argument, and I ran a statistical model, and I looked at the rate ratios, and the rates were the number of homicides per licensed cabs for each city. And I ran this model, and I determined whether or not camera installation had any effect on rates of homicide among taxi cab drivers. And before I do this, so the rate ratio, the RR, comma, it says adjusted. I adjusted for the fact that they were decreasing anyway with time. That's very important because I didn't expect to see an effect because they were decreasing anyway. And then the other thing I adjusted for was the crime rate for each city, because that's also very important because some cities are so much more dangerous than others. And what I found was the rate ratio is 0.13. So that means 1 would mean that there's no effect. Greater than 1 is when we're looking at cholesterol with cardiovascular outcomes. That's when you see greater than 1 odds ratios, where high cholesterol has a deleterious effect on your health. This is less than 1. That means it's protective, or it's suggestive of a protective nature. So 1 divided by 0.13 is 7 point something. That means there's a 7-fold decrease in the homicide rate among taxi cab drivers post-camera installation compared with pre-camera installation. And that's very